Welcome back to MustardHub Voices, Behind the Build. In these episodes, I sit down with the people building, backing, and running better workplaces. I'm your host, Curtis Forbes, and my guest today is DeDe Halfhill. DeDe is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel, keynote speaker, leadership advisor who helps leaders master the unseen, the human side of leadership that most people avoid, but everyone feels. Over a 25-year military career, she led thousands of airmen, served 2 tours in Iraq, advised the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and directed press operations for the Department of Defense. She was also chief public affairs for U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds. Today, she speaks and advises across industries, from construction and finance to Fortune 500 companies, helping leaders surface hidden tensions, build trust, and have the conversations teams tend to avoid. Her leadership story is featured in Brené Brown's bestseller, Dare to Lead, and on 60 Minutes. A Georgetown-certified executive coach and former national security fellow, DeDe brings a rare view of what it actually takes to lead people well. Welcome to Behind the Build, DeDe. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm super excited about our conversation today.
I tried to squeeze it all into a bio, and it's like I feel like I could have had another 2,000 words and it still wouldn't have covered everything.
I'll be honest, sometimes I hear it and I think, whoa, who is that?
Yeah, I want to meet that person.
25 years is a long time to pack a lot in, so.
It is, yeah. So just taking a minute to kind of breathe in who's with me today on my on this podcast. So let's talk about that 25 years, in the Air Force, retired a colonel, advised the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I mean, that's about as high stakes, as leadership gets. What I'm curious, what made you leave that world into teaching other leaders about the, that human emotional side of leading that you're so passionate about?
It's a great question because I think it's something I talk with leaders about regularly. I loved the Air Force. I absolutely adored the people. So I loved the institution. I adored the people, but I was finding myself less excited about the day-to-day work. Now, my background was in public affairs, as you mentioned, so communications. And I enjoyed it. And I think it fit a skill set that I have naturally, but I wasn't getting up every day saying, I just can't wait to get to work and work with the press and put out key messages. But what I really did love throughout my experience in the Air Force was those moments I was in command. And what I loved about being in command was a couple things, really, was having the ability to affect policy at senior levels that allowed us to take care of a large group of people through just policy. And I loved being able to take care of them at the same time at the individual level. And doing the work to understand, how do I really build trust? How do I inspire them? How do I bring out the best in who they are and bring their gifts to our organization? So having the ability to do that at both ends was something I got up every single day, completely I don't even know if excited was the word for it. I just absolutely loved it. And what I realized is, because the military is the way it is, it's kind of an up or out. They train you in this one core field. And I knew that my time of being able to take care of airmen that way was probably not going to happen again, that I was going to stay in this space of public affairs because, understandably so, that's what the military trained me in. That's what most of my experience was in. And we call it needs of the Air Force. That was actually what they needed me to do. They needed me to go on and stay in the career field public affairs. And I wasn't as excited about it as I had been about being able to take care of airmen and be around airmen every day. And so a lot of the work I do with leaders is understanding our values and how our values show up for us every day at work. And what I was realizing was I was no longer able to contribute in a way that was in alignment with both what I love, what I value, and I think the skill set I possessed. And so I knew it was time for me to leave so that I could keep living into that space and supporting people and taking care of leaders. One of the things around the lieutenant colonel rank that I realized is we talk a ton about leadership development.
Hmm.
In almost all of our organizations, we talk very little about leadership support. And I think
Fascinating.
that's a huge distinction. And I realized I want to go support leaders who are doing the really hard work every day. So that's what I decided to do.
And that never even dawned on me until today. I've already learned something new. I I like the way you put that about, waking up every day and at least feeling like you're reaching that sort of personal mission of yours, so to speak, right? Y- You've said more than once, I think, right? You talk about some of the biggest lessons that you've learned that didn't really come from dramatic moments, right? But you call them ordinary days, right? So I, I'm curious what one of those ordinary days taught you that stuck, right? What does that look like in practice?
Oh gosh. Can I tell you a story?
I Those tend to land best. So yes, please
Okay.
do.
It's going to sound so ridiculous, but I often look back as this was the moment where it kind of all clicked for me. I was in Iraq. I was a squadron commander over there. I was responsible for a lot of the functions that allowed the base to operate and take care of people. And I was also responsible for the dining facilities. And we had 6 of them, all that served 1,000 people at a time. I used to tell people on any given day, we were serving the equivalent of 32 golden corrals. Like that was the throughput we had in our
Oh,
dining facilities. It was huge. And I had a wing commander who was very passionate about fitness. He was very passionate about how do we take care of ourselves so that we are ready for the fight, so that we can bring our best to the mission. And I totally got that. But one of the things that was kind of a quirk of that was he didn't like Cocoa Puffs. And he didn't like seeing Cocoa Puffs in the dining facility every day. I don't know why. I mean, I do, I think I know why, but it's not the healthiest thing to fuel our bodies with. And I got it.
okay.
Now, the way the replenishment of the cereals worked is every day the staff would put out a new box of mixed cereals. So for some reason, there were a lot of people over there who didn't like Cocoa Puffs. They loved the frosted shredded wheat. If in case you're ever curious, like man, we could not keep the frosted shredded wheat in stock. Like you had to get there at like 6 a.m. to get that cereal, but the Cocoa Puffs were plentiful. And he told my boss, I need DeDe to get rid of the Cocoa Puffs. Now, I'm also responsible for mortuary affairs. I'm responsible for housing. I'm responsible for transient housing. I'm responsible for accountability of the 50,000 boots on the ground we had at the time in Iraq, right? Like my team was also responsible for monitoring that personnel footprint and the accountability of all those people. So certainly Cocoa Puffs at the dining facility were not big
Yeah.
on my radar.
Low on the priority list.
Right, right. And so I give it to my captain and I say, we'll call him Bob. And I say, Bob, I'm going to need you to get rid of the Cocoa Puffs. And he says, I'm all over it, ma'am. And I'm like, okay, whatever. I've got bigger things on my mind. I don't even really pay attention. So a week goes by. My boss says to me, DeDe, what's going on with the Cocoa Puffs? And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, they're growing. And I'm like, what? I asked Bob to get rid of them. So I go to the dining facility. Sure enough, the Cocoa Puffs have now taken up about a quarter of the table. It's like a 6-foot diameter table, right? So now Cocoa Puffs are kind of taking over this section of the table. Another week goes by. My boss says to me again, DeDe, I thought I asked you to get rid of the Cocoa Puffs. And I'm like, what? Now, I was going through the various dining facilities, so I wasn't always seeing this particular dining facility in the morning. So I go back to Bob. Bob, I told you to get rid of the Cocoa Puffs. I go over to the dining facility to check it out. The table is now half Cocoa Puffs. Okay. I say to Bob, I'm not kidding, Bob. I really need you to get rid of these Cocoa Puffs. Bob says, ma'am, we're all over it. We're all over it. We're getting it done. And I'm like, it's taken 2 weeks. You're obviously not getting it done. Like, get it done. Okay. Another week goes by. I walk into the dining facility. It's like 6 a.m. in the morning. I walk in. I haven't had coffee. I'm exhausted. And the very first thing I see is a table And it's not only a quarter of a table of Cocoa Puffs, a half a table of Cocoa Puffs. The table now has, there is a table now completely dedicated to Cocoa Puffs. There is an entire table of Cocoa Puffs. And not only is there now a separate table of Cocoa Puffs, but they are built up in pyramid fashion. So they're made to look like a decorative function in the dining facility. I lose my shit. I march across the dining facility and like I grab this garbage can, and by the handful, I'm like shoveling Cocoa Puffs into the garbage can. And I get the whole table into the garbage can. You know how like that moment you kind of, I mean, all of us have been there, right? Where we kind of, everything is pent up and you finally just kind of, it finally explode. And when you're done, you go, and you can just feel all of that pent up frustration, whatever, come out. Well, I turn around and I see 3 of my airmen. Now, I had always told myself I was going to be a commander who would be like calm, cool, and collected, and people could trust and would respect and would feel safe. And I turn around and there's 3 of my airmen seeing me lose my shit over Cocoa Puffs. And I think it didn't really hit me then, but a few years later, I had the opportunity to go through a coaching program, and the coaching program at Georgetown. And they would tell us, bring your stuff that as a leader you want to work through, because like for 6 months, we're going to work through it. And for some reason, I thought of that moment and what the coaching program taught me through that moment was that what showed up that day was anger. And if you'd have asked me, yeah, I was really angry. But through the coaching exploration, what I realized is underneath that anger was fear that my boss would think I wasn't capable because I couldn't get a captain to get rid of Cocoa Puffs. It was embarrassment because of the 4 commanders in my group, I was younger than all of them by 4 years. I was the only female. I was the only one who was commanding a squadron I didn't grow up in. So I had no expertise in this squadron, unlike my peers who all grew up in the squadron they were commanding. And so I realized there was embarrassment, there was fear, I felt like dismissed because Bob was like, and I'm like, why did Bob do that?
Yeah.
So I had all these emotions underneath. What showed up is anger. But if you think about it, anger allows us one option, maybe 2 options. 1, I explode, or 2, I shut down. Those are my options through anger. But if I can do the work to really understand, oh, am I embarrassed? Well, then who can I talk to talk through that embarrassment? Maybe talk to my peers and have them say, no, you're not alone. Like, man, we all struggle. This is hard for all of us. If I'm in fear, maybe I talk to my boss and say, I'm really struggling. He's got 10 years on me. So he can mentor me. He can help me navigate this leadership challenge that feels new and feels hard and I feel lost. And if it's dismissed, then maybe I sit down and I have a different conversation with Bob. Instead of just saying, I told you to get it done, I get more curious with Bob and understand, like, why am I reacting to Bob the way I am? And so as leaders, as a leader, it taught me, and something I think I deal with a lot of leaders now, is the one thing we want is options when it comes to problem solving, right? We want as many options as we can because that's when we find the best solution. But if all I'm saying is I'm angry, I am completely limiting my options, and I'm lacking precision, really, is what's going on. Is I'm lacking precision in what problem I'm solving and the way to solve it. And so that moment, while it was kind of about Cocoa Puffs, it was a huge lesson for me in that by not understanding my own emotional landscape, I am hurting myself as a leader in problem solving. I'm very practical when I talk about emotion, but for me, that's what it was. It was, I'm limiting myself.
You talk about emotion as precision, right?
Mm-hmm.
In problem solving, not really as being soft. I think that example with anger makes a lot of sense then you only have like one move, right? Or I guess two, like you said. And I think we all want options. There's also another story you tell about a regular Tuesday afternoon with a room full of airmen where you changed a word in a question and the whole room opened up.
Yeah.
Um, Take us through that moment, because I also think it's really interesting, and this idea of emotional fluency I think is really it's important, right? It's critical, right? And I keep coming back to those conversations that we've had, that idea that we've slowly lost language for emotion at work, right? We talked a little bit about that, and I kind of want to unpack that too, like where or what you mean by the language sort of disappearing. But what was
Yeah.
that word that changed it all?
To kind of answer both your questions, I'll give a little bit of a preview. So in 2014, I was doing some work for the Air Force, and I, through a series of events, found a 1948 manual that the Air Force had its senior leaders write up on how do we want, the Air Force was a brand new service, and they said, how do we want our leaders to lead? And the men who had just come home from World War II were tasked with writing this manual for this brand new service, basically saying from scratch, how are we going to engage as leaders? And long story short, we can get into it later, but it's rife with emotional language. I mean, they did not shy away at all with talking about emotion. And one of my favorite quotes in there is, I'm going to summarize it because I don't have it verbatim, but basically it says, the behavior is merely a symptom. It is not a cause. And to say that behavior is the cause is to say that a plane crashed because it hit the ground. Right? And so they're
Yeah.
saying, like, yes, a plane crashes because it hits the ground. That is the surface level
Yeah.
understanding. But what happened leading up to that plane and that outcome? And they are saying the same thing about humans. They were saying a soldier's disgruntlement is merely a symptom, it is not a cause. And I think about that quote when I think about the Cocoa Puffs moment, right? Because, like, what was my plane crashing was me freaking out at Cocoa Puffs. But then because I had that awareness, and honestly, the manual kind of gave me permission. Like, I had been taught my whole career, like, oh, emotions, leave them at the door. We don't talk about that here. And this manual flipped that on its head for me.
Yeah.
Because of that, the moment you're talking about with my airmen, it was, like you said, it was an everyday Tuesday. I was out presenting an award. And, just to give a little context, I had about 40 airmen there. They were young. They were in their early 20s. I'm the colonel. I'm an old woman to them. Like, they don't really like to chat with me. There's nothing good comes from talking with the colonel, like they're like, just stay out of trouble. They're probably all terrified. And one of them raises his hands because I had presented the award and said, what questions are on your mind, And one of them, brave enough, raises his hand and he says, ma'am, when is the ops tempo going to slow down? Because we're tired. And I said, yeah, I get it. I get it. And so I said, how many of you are tired? And, like 3/4 of the room raised their hand, and I go out to organizations all the time now and I'll say, like, how many of you in the audience are tired? And they're like, well, the whole room raises their hands because we're exhausted. There's so much coming at us. And so I said to my airmen that day, I said, yeah, I get it. Right. Like, we've been at war for 20 years. When we're not at war, we're at home preparing for an inspection. When we're not preparing for an inspection, we're training for an exercise. Like, there is always something going on. And I said, but I want to share with you an article I read 3 days ago. And, like, literally, I just read this article, and it was an article in Harvard Business Review. And it was talking about how this organization was going into 5 different companies that were all reporting high levels of exhaustion. And it wanted to understand, like, what was going on, that 5 companies that their employee base were reporting these high levels of exhaustion. And so it spent months talking to their teams, talking to their leaders, looking at their processes. And it came back and it said, after all this time, what we have found out is not that people are tired, but people are lonely. And that feeling of loneliness is manifesting itself as a feeling of exhaustion, right? Again,
Yeah.
what was going on underneath? So I decided to ask this group of airmen, predominantly men. And I think that's important because, like, I don't know that I would have asked this question of a group of men before my Cocoa Puff experience. But I said, if I were to ask you all instead of who's tired, who's lonely, how many of you would raise your hands? And like I said, I didn't expect any of them to raise their hands, really candidly. Like, I thought it was a rhetorical question. I think maybe they'll just think about this. And about 3/4 of the room raised their hands.
Wow.
And I stood there for a moment, like, I'll be honest with you, like, oh shit, now what do I do? Because I was not equipped to have this conversation. I don't have a therapeutic background. I'm not, uh, at this point, I had my coaching certification, but, and so I was like, oh, I don't know what to do. But at the same time, you know, I'm sure your listeners have heard the problem we are navigating both within the Department of Defense and with veterans, the problem of suicide. And given my career field, I'd spent years trying to understand, how do we message our airmen to reach them? How do we message our airmen to make them aware of the services we have? How do we communicate with them so they feel safe? And I was working with, in my own organizations when I had command opportunities, and with very senior leaders. I had started working at the 4-star level probably in 2006. So I was
Wow.
often working with very, very senior leaders on, how do we, as a service, as an organization, as a department, you think about, I was working with even the chairman later on, as a department, how do we reach them? How do we reach them so they know that this is a problem we can help them navigate? And here I am on a Tuesday afternoon, and instead of constantly trying to reach them, they were now reaching me. Like, they were in that moment, and they were giving me an opportunity that before I didn't have, right? I didn't have that option because we weren't using the right language. But as soon as I said, how many of you are tired? Instead of how many of you are tired, how many of you are lonely? And they trusted me enough. Like, there had been a lot of work leading up to this, right? But they trusted me enough to be honest and authentic. And we got to have the most amazing conversation that day. And not only that day, but for months. I mean, the rest of my tour, really. And I still to this day have people reach out when they read that story. But they would come up to me and they would say, ma'am, I'm lonely. What do I do? Ma'am, I feel really disconnected. How do I reach out? How do I build connection with people? And think about that as a leader. Again, it goes back to options, but we all have problems that we're trying to solve. Every organization has a problem we're trying to solve. And we often look at that problem when we attack it over and over and over and over again, right? It's that whole Einstein quote. I'm not going to say it right now because I can't remember, but ignorance is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Is that the right quote?
It's pretty close. Ignorance, stupidity. I've heard it a million different ways. Insanity.
Yeah. And if you think about it, what happened was airmen would tell us they were tired all the time. They would always say they were tired. And as leaders, we would say, oh, go get some rest. Let me look at your workload. Let me change your schedule. But if you tell me you're tired and I tell you to go get some rest, I'm actually exacerbating the
All right.
very thing they
You have
shared with me that day.
you have this line that I love. It's when you don't have the language, you don't get the skill.
Mm-hmm.
So why does language have to come first? Or does it? I mean, does it even have to come first?
I think it does. I think it does. There's research out there, and I'm actually in the middle of it right now, about how language affects our behavior and the way we engage. Um, I think when you lack a language, you lack that precision. It goes back to that, right? Like if Brené Brown talks about the fact that on average, a person can identify 3 emotions: angry, sad, and happy. Right? Angry, sad, and pissed is how she says it. But no, yeah, happy, sad, and pissed. And if you think about it, again, it goes back to the Cocoa Puffs. If those are the only ways I can describe my emotions, then I am I'm blocking off all options. And I think the more we have the language and the more we use the language, the less scary the emotion feels because the language normalizes it first.
I like that.
I think I'm in the research right now. I'll let you know.
I want to bring this from the military into like Main Street.
Yeah.
So, you get brought in to some pretty, some male dominated, hard charging industries, construction, I think you right, in finance, right? You help leaders, I think, lead a little less with the stick, maybe a little more by actually connecting folks. When you walk in, what's the resistance you usually, hit?
I sometimes recently I've noticed something, and that is when I talk about emotion, because my stories are military, people will say to me, well, it makes sense that you have to talk about emotion because in the military you do hard things. And so what they're telling themselves is, we're not doing as hard of things as you're doing in the military. Like in the military, it's life and death, right? Like we say that a lot, which 90% of the time it's not. Like 90% of the time we're in our offices, And they say, you do hard things. So it makes sense that you have to go to that deep place. And then I go into the military, and I had several friends who read Dare to Lead when it came out, and they said, yeah, that's great, but we can't do that here because we do hard things. So one group is saying understanding emotion makes sense because you do hard things. And the other group is saying we don't have time for emotion because we do hard things. And so both, I would say, like, both communities are fighting emotion for different reasons.
Yeah.
So the biggest resistance I have is that emotion doesn't belong here. Either it doesn't belong here because we're not doing hard things, or it doesn't belong here because we are doing hard things. And that's a message we've received over the last 50 years that I believe is woefully inaccurate.
I think a lot of leaders, right? They hear be more human, be more empathetic, and they assume that it means like getting emotionally pulled under, right? Or going soft on their standards, right? So where does that fear come from? Why is it wrong?
When we've talked before, and I told you about the manual, which is, again, the Air Force's very first manual on leadership, they talk so much about emotion. And what my research has shown is that over the last 75 years, all of that emotional language has been removed from military manuals. And at first I thought it was just the military. And then I found out that Google did a study called the Engram study, and they found that emotional language, they call it sentiment-based language, but emotional-based language has dropped 60% across all published texts in the last 100 years. So the military was actually just my way of seeing that the same thing has happened across society, that we have lost this emotional language, which, again, if you lose the language, I think you lose the ability. And so we've replaced it. The studies have shown that as we lost that emotional language, we replaced it with leadership language that was about results, accountability, competencies, things that you could measure, things that you could scale.
Yeah, all the wonderful things that breed toxic leaders. Yes, of course.
Right. Yeah, right. And so I think the fact that what's interesting, I I did a keynote. What's today? I did a keynote on Sunday for Georgia Municipal. It's the Georgia Municipal Association. So it was basically all the municipal governments across the state of Georgia, mayors, city councils, city managers. Mm-hmm. And I gave a presentation and I talk about Doolittle because there's a quote in the manual about General Doolittle. And in it, it talks about how he was asked to go to theater to show the capability of the B-26. It was a new platform, but it wasn't doing well. It was crashing a lot. And Eisenhower sent him, over there to talk to the men about the B-26 and to show them that the plane was fine. But before he did that, he sat down with them. And the manual says he sat with the pilots and listened to their fears before showing them what it could do. And that's such a powerful statement of empathy. They don't call it empathy, but that's because they did say he listened to them with sympathy. They didn't have the language for empathy. Okay. He listened to them with sympathy before showing them what it could do. And I think we've lost that idea that empathy matters because we're not seeing it modeled. And to be fair to leaders of my generation, we didn't see it modeled. And they're in this space now going, but what does that look like? How do I do that without getting sucked in? Empathy sounds like this big emotional word. Yet, I don't know if you saw the news, but I'm not a sports fan. So forgive me if I say this incorrectly. But it just popped up on my Google this morning. The coach of the Knicks, right? They just won after a 53-year not winning. And the story from ESPN was all about how, what was his name? Is it Davis? No, tell me, do you know his name? I won't put you on the spot. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I put me on the spot. I'm a basketball fan, but I don't know who their coach is right now. I'm not a Knicks fan. Sorry for anybody listening.
But if anyone knows the coach and can put me in touch, I would love to talk to him. So I'll put that shout out there. I desperately want to talk to him about this story because I think it relates to the Doolittle story. Okay. Because the whole ESPN story talks about how he sat down with different members of his team with dinner and just listened to them.
It's so funny. We this day and age, it feels like we speak to be heard, we speak to be understood rather than listening with that intent. And so, inevitably, right, it should come as no surprise that, in the public domain, in politics, in global affairs, in households, right, that there's this, you're talking past each other, right? Mm-hmm. And there's no real intent on having a conversation to understand. It's having the conversation to be understood. And I think it's one of the things that makes conversations so challenging, right? Is because if you take that moment to listen and to understand the person sitting on the other side of the table, right? It's almost offering something of value, right? And when somebody feels like they're heard or they're understood, they themselves become a little bit more open to whatever this conversation is looking to produce, I think, in general. Yeah. And in turn, it's funny you mentioned they didn't have the word for empathetic. When we talked last time, I think, you mentioned, you told me a little bit about that story and how the language has really been stripped from all this, the policy, the manuals, in favor of more these other things, and that being direct, being empathetic can live together. I don't think that everybody sees that, right? Expectations, I think, and compassion aren't actually in conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you coach leaders to hold both at the same? Yeah, try to fit this in a couple of minutes. How do you try to coach leaders to hold both of those things at the same time?
I think this is where my communication background has been so helpful because there's two data points. When we did a lot of work when I was one of my later jobs in the military with squadron commanders. And when we asked them, what keeps you from being empathetic, doing the behaviors? So often it was, I just don't have time. And
Mm.
if I go there, I'm going to get sucked in. I just don't have time. But when we gave them the skills of empathy and we showed them how simple it actually is, it was no longer about time. Because actually, when you know the skills and you can use them, you save time. Because another Brené Brown quote that I live by, a leader must spend a reasonable amount of time attending to fears and feelings, or they will squander an unreasonable amount of time managing ineffective and unproductive behavior. And
I got to commit that to memory myself.
I mean, it says everything, doesn't it?
It
Like as
does.
a leader,
Yeah.
you either spend time on the front end or you will spend time on the back end, like period dot. And so when we gave leaders the skill, they could see, oh, it isn't a matter of time, it's a matter of skill. But the other thing, I think the second data point is so often when I am out talking to senior leaders, there's this idea that because they believe empathy is soft, right? Which is that's the belief I'm trying to flip, that emotion is soft. These men in 1948, like they had the world on their shoulders
Mm-hmm.
and their results weren't optional and they were watching men die. Emotion wasn't soft for them. It was operational. Period dot. Like there was no question that this stuff was soft. They knew they had to understand their men to get the outcome and the results they needed, right? And when I talk to leaders and we start talking about emotion, the biggest fear I run into is I will appear soft, I will appear weak, which means my authority will not be respected and I will not be able to hold people accountable. So it comes down to authority and accountability. And so to answer your question, long story short,
Yeah.
I think when you understand how simple empathy can be, but you have a language for it and you know how to say it, you can say it in a way that is still very much in alignment with your authority and with the role you have of maintaining accountability. We think it is going to strip it, and actually it only enhances it. And the manual said that as well, that leaders who could do this, they inspired deeper commitment and trust in their men. But for some reason, we've believed this idea that they, like you said, are at odds when actually they are so, I don't have the right word, but like so symbiotic. Is that the right word?
Yeah, you've even said before that leaders make that mistake of like compliance for commitment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Silence for alignment. Um, I'm curious, like they're all related, right? I'm curious if there's any that trip people up more than others, right? And I think that there's this underlying like issue of courage in a lot of ways, right? You talk about the everyday courage, right? Those small conversations that a lot of leaders avoid. Um, you know, for leaders of organizations, for owners, for operators who are wearing a million hats. I mean, what is that conversation that they most often duck, and what does it cost them? Right back to that Brené Brown quote, right? What they're avoid these things because they don't want to be seen or perceived in that negative way, you know, that they've you know put in their mind. What does that then wind up costing them on the backside? You know, how do those leaders work through those fears that they have, so handing things
Mm.
off doesn't feel so heavy, right? Or not be so scared because the business is on the line. I don't does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I'm going to answer your question. You might not be happy with the answer, but I believe there's another long story I won't go into because I know we're limited on time. But the lesson I took away from this moment where I'd asked my commanders to have a conversation and they didn't is that each of them felt vulnerable for their own reason,
Yeah.
right? One commander wanted more information. One commander didn't know the right way to say it. And one commander was navigating his own lived experience as it related to the issue at hand. And what I learned in that moment is that there is no one answer to what are the conversations we avoid. But the conversations we avoid are the ones that we ourselves feel most vulnerable in. You know, I keep quoting Brené Brown, but I'm trained in her work. Her work is really how I started navigating this. I started following her work around the same time I was going through the coaching program, and they're so wonderfully related. And Brené talks about vulnerability being anytime we feel risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And I always ask leaders, is there a single day you come to work and you are not accepting risk? No.
Yeah.
Is there a single day you come to work and you have absolute certainty for what's going to happen? No.
No.
And then I say, do you care about the mission? Do you care about the people? Do you care about the paycheck? Like, then you're emotionally exposed because you care. And so if you think about it, as leaders, we are vulnerable. We are navigating vulnerability all day, every day. People have this misconception because she's really popularized the word vulnerability, and they think it means I have to show up and share my deep, dark secrets. I have to show people all the things that are hard. But that's actually not what she's saying. What she's saying is that as leaders, we are navigating, we are feeling a sense of vulnerability all day, every day, because we are accepting risk and because it's uncertain. And my gosh, we're navigating so much uncertainty right now. And because we care. The problem is, if you don't know how to navigate that well, that's when all of our unhelpful behaviors show up, one of which is avoidance. And so in those moments, people have to do their own work to understand what about this is making me uncomfortable, because there's no one answer. You have to address your own feeling of vulnerability before you can do the hard thing.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the manual talks about this. This is why I'm fascinated with this manual. It says, will you have the moral courage to do the hard thing? But
It
they
says it
then
like
talk,
that.
yeah, they talk, here's what's really interesting. They're talking about shame, and they say, protect yourself from shame by having the moral courage to do the hard thing.
Oh, I love that. That's in the manual.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
I
that's,
know.
that's great. This is fantastic. What's happened?
I know.
We need to.
And
Okay.
so I sometimes, when I talk about the manual, I sometimes say, Brené is giving us a modern language to help us regain what these men tried to give us through wisdom.
Um, yeah, I like pointing out that vulnerability doesn't mean, you know, dropping all the skeletons in the closet. That's not
Mm-hmm,
what vulnerability means. It means be human,
mm-hmm,
acknowledge that you're human. Don't run away from the fact that you're human,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
which, and this is like totally by accident, um, I wanted to talk a little bit about not being human. Um, you, not exactly how I wanted to phrase that, but I think, it makes sense. It's a nice little segue.
Yeah.
You believe you've mentioned, right, that AI really takes over a lot of this technical work, but the real advantage, I think, goes to those people who can navigate human emotion,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And again, so this is kind of how I think about being vulnerable. I think about like accepting the fact that you're human and embracing that, right, and not running away from those things. I think that there's a lot of places, military probably one of them, right, where you feel this outsized burden, right, to be perfect,
yeah.
right? You have to be perfect. You even in leading an organization, right? You have to make the decisions. The decisions are expected to be the right decisions. You have the weight of the world on your shoulders. Everybody's expecting things from you, and there's no real tolerance from that, high level of expectation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's a hard thing to have to deal with, I think. And so I can understand why a lot of people, who are laying on the couch in the therapist's office in their later years, trying to
Yeah.
work through, what it means to navigate that human emotion. I'm curious to see how you think that plays out, with AI kind of working its way into the future of work, into the future of what leadership looks like, how organizations are utilizing these things. And I mean organizations from corporate America to government affairs.
Mm-hmm. The manual actually says, which I love, because if you think about it, they were going through a similar technological transformation. They had gone from the prop plane to the atomic weapon in less than a decade, which meant most people were navigating a technology system they weren't trained in. And they were being asked to implement a technology they had no experience with. And it says the more powerful the tool, as they were talking about technology, the more powerful the tool, the more your people need to know you see them and not just the system. And I think about that a lot as we're navigating AI, because I just read an article this morning talking about I think it was the CTO at Meta who came out and said morale is at an all-time low. And it was attributing that to this idea that all these people were forcibly moved into an AI division. I just read it briefly, so I don't have all the details, but they were being forcibly moved into, after the layoffs, a large section of people were being forcibly moved into this AI division. And again, with no conversation about what it meant for them and no conversation about how they felt about it as people. And I think that's probably where I think we are right now, is we're doing so much with AI, but we're not talking about the fear that creates in our teammates. We're not talking about the grief we're experiencing because of how things are changing or the people we're losing as layoffs happen. We're not talking about the uncertainty, as we are hearing so much about things being replaced or how jobs are changing. And the problem is, like, I know we say we're going to, like, AI is going to take over, and within I've watched the podcast where people are saying within 5 years, no one's going to have a job. And I'm like, I don't see that happening, which means leaders are going to still want results out of people. And if you want results, you still have to see them as humans. And we have no greater need than to be seen, valued, and heard. And that's what the manual was telling us. Like, no matter how powerful the tool, your people still need to know you see them.
It's amazing.
And so I think the leaders who can navigate that space, they will have, I 100% believe, like, they will have the advantage, because they will have the power of the technology and the dedication and the courage and the commitment of the people. And when you put those two things together, that is where power will be. Like, I believe that 100%.
I think my next mission after this podcast is to figure out how we can get that manual back into circulation.
Well, I'm writing a book, but it might take me a while.
I love that. It's funny how, as much as times change, they kind of stay the same, right?
Yeah.
Which obviously is not a saying I made up, but there's so much truth to that, right? Because we're going back and reading something like that, and it resonates as much today as I'm sure it did in 1948. Which is, that's incredibly powerful. When you look at where work is heading, right? What shift do you think leaders are underestimating the most on the human side? Is it the understanding the fear and grief that's going on, or is it something else, something different?
I think they're underestimating. I think I'm just going to say this ugly because I'm kind of wrestling with it in my mind, but I think they are underestimating how powerful people can be when they feel seen, valued, and heard. I think leaders today underestimate that, and they think, I'll get to that when the results are when we've finished what we really need to do. When the results are in, then I'll worry about the people. And I go back, like, man, think about the environment those men were leading in. There is nothing more, we are not navigating any more uncertainty than they did. We are not navigating the emotional severity any more than they did. And they said emphatically, it is a leader's responsibility and it's operational. And so I think leaders today are underestimating what is possible I mean, look what these men did. They won a world war.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we don't want a tenth of that result in our organizations. Like,
Yeah.
heck yeah, we do, right? And if they could convince, if they could win a world war by understanding this thing that we have dismissed, that we have said doesn't belong. And here's an interesting little tidbit, because I've been looking at other manuals. I was looking at the Army manual because the Air Force had just come from the Army. We were part of the Army Air Corps, and we were standing up our own service. That's why they were asked to write the manual. The Army manual, which was kind of being based on history, right? They were updating their manual, but they weren't writing from scratch. And they also talked about emotion, but they talked about emotion in one chapter. And so it was separate from results, just like we think today. But the Air Force manual did not have a separate chapter on understanding feelings. It was throughout the entire manual, right alongside operational leadership, like right alongside the results. They did not separate them. They saw them as one. And I think like that's what leaders are underestimating. They think it's this thing we can do later. But the power really comes when you can put them together. Like I don't even know how to say it emphatically enough.
Well, I'll give you an opportunity, right? Because I want to wrap up here.
Okay.
I mean, you've watched a lot of leaders learn, well, the hard way, really, actually, right? Um, what's one lesson, right, that you wish every leader internalized earlier than they typically do? Let's say you were approached by whether it was Fortune 500 or a military leader asking you, DeDe, what's one thing I need to internalize, sooner than not?
I think, I often share 3 questions when I'm out presenting. The 3 questions I ask leaders to take home with them are, what's underneath this? What does this moment need from me? And can I stay one more minute? But I think, meaning like, can I sit in this hard moment? But I think the most important of those 3 is getting very practiced at asking ourselves, what's underneath this? Because I tell leaders, you can't address what you can't see, but what you can't see is affecting everything you can. So all those metrics and those results you're chasing are actually being affected by this emotional undercurrent. And your inability to ask what that emotional undercurrent is actually doing to your organization, that is what is getting in the way. And so if I had to give leaders one thing, it would be internalize and make it habit to ask, what is underneath this?
So don't just accept that the plane hit the ground. Ask, what was the malfunction that caused the plane to
Yeah,
hit
and
the
not
ground?
just the malfunction, right? Because that is a system. And that's what leaders do. Like Eisenhower in the Doolittle example, Eisenhower was looking at the production of the plane as the problem. But Doolittle found out it was actually the fear of the pilots. And it was things they were seeing that had nothing to do with production. And so ask leaders like not just what malfunctioned, but what was the human experience of how people were relating to this and what's underneath that.
Yeah, even more sort of holistic. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, DeDe. This was a lot of fun. I'm so glad that you joined me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great questions.
Well, I worked very hard on this. Thanks to all of you watching and listening to MustardHub Voices Behind the Build. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Please visit MustardHub to learn more about us and our AI predictive foresight, how it powers behavioral workforce intelligence for the global workforce. And until next time.